Charleston slips into evening wrapped in honey-colored light that drapes itself over wrought iron balconies like the last note of an old song. The cobblestone streets still hold the warmth of the day, and the breeze from the harbor carries salt, magnolia, and the faint echo of stories that were never fully told. Simone Hart's house sits on a quiet, oak-lined street where every home has a longer memory than the people living inside it. White facade, pale blue shutters, stone steps softened by time, and 1,000 carefully staged charity photos. The porch lights are turned on earlier than usual tonight, glowing with a welcome that feels almost ceremonial. Inside the dining room is flawless. 3 plates, not 2. 3. The Limoges china that Simone only brings out for milestone anniversaries rests on the walnut table. The silverware has been polished until it mirrors the candlelight in thin, trembling lines. 3 wine glasses, each angled with surgical precision, spaced as if measured by breath rather than by hand. Simone stands at the head of the table in a black silk dress that slips over her shoulders like a shadow. Her natural hair is gathered low at the nape of her neck, a few soft curls left free, as though tenderness still exists somewhere in the room. The deep wine color on her lips makes her face both warm and untouchable. She is not rushing. She adjusts the fork beside the 3rd plate, the place set for a woman who has never crossed this threshold before tonight. 1 chair for the wife, 1 chair for the husband, and 1 chair for the truth. In Charleston, dinners are known for their grace, for smiles that never falter, for conversations carefully trimmed so no one has to feel uncomfortable. Simone has lived inside that choreography for 10 years as the wife of Grant Holloway, the man local magazines call the golden heir of the modern South. Tonight, the room is just as beautiful as always, only its meaning has changed. She steps back to take in the full table. 3 plates, a verdict presented as ritual. The clock on the wall reads 7:43. The doorbell rings. The sound is polite, almost delicate, but inside Simone's chest it lands like a gunshot. She doesn't hurry to the door. She inhales the way she does before entering an operating room. Not to find calm, but to remind her body that every movement from this point forward must be precise. When she opens the door, the woman standing on the porch is younger by nearly a decade. Blonde hair, effortless makeup, a white dress that whispers money without needing to say it. She holds the invitation in both hands as if it were a question she isn't ready to ask. "Dr. Hart?" the woman says softly. Simone smiles, the same composed smile that donors, patients, and hospital boards trust without hesitation. "Please," she replies gently, "call me Simone." For a brief, suspended second, their eyes meet. No screaming, no accusations, just 2 women standing in a doorway, while the truth steps quietly between them. "Come in," Simone says. The woman crosses the threshold, her perfume drifting into the house like a memory that does not belong here. And then she sees the table. 3 plates, the color drains from her face. Simone's lipstick becomes the only warm thing in the room. "We're waiting for my husband," she says, her voice as calm as if she were announcing dessert. Somewhere across the city, Grant Holloway still believes he is coming home to an anniversary dinner, to the perfect wife who will raise a glass to 10 years of marriage. Here, in this room, that story ended long before he put his key in the lock. Simone pulls out a chair and gestures for her guest to sit. The movement is graceful, almost kind. That kindness tightens the air more than anger ever could. "Some truths," she says, placing her napkin across her lap, "need an audience." If you're listening to this and you feel your heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from recognition, because you know what it means when a woman stops asking for permission to exist inside her own life. Stay with me a little longer. What's coming isn't loud, but it will change everything. And if you've ever had a moment where you realize you deserve more than what you were given, leave a quiet trace of yourself in the comments. I read them the way women read each other's silences, And you'd be surprised how many of us are standing in the same doorway. Simone pours the wine. The dark red liquid turns in the glasses like something alive. The third glass remains untouched. The sound of a key sliding into the front door breaks the stillness. Grant is home. Simone doesn't turn around immediately. She sets the bottle down and straightens her plate. A small, perfect movement, as though the entire evening were nothing more than a carefully rehearsed ceremony. In the reflection of the glass cabinet, she sees herself, upright, composed, no longer the woman who learned how to make her life smaller so it could fit beside a man's. The door opens. Grant's voice carries down the hallway, warm, confident, unguarded. "Babe, I'm home." Simone closes her eyes for the briefest second. When she opens them, her gaze is clear. Tonight, no one is performing, and the three plates on the table, glowing under candlelight, wait patiently for the truth to take its seat. Before there were three plates, there were photographs. Charleston loved its photographs. The kind taken beneath live oaks draped in silver moss. The kind where champagne caught the light just right. The kind that made everything look like it had always been effortless. And in those photographs, Grant Holloway and Dr. Simone Hart existed as something close to myth. They stood on the marble steps of the Hollingsworth Foundation in black tie, her hand resting lightly at his wrist, his palm placed at the small of her back, in a gesture that seemed both protective and proprietary. Cameras adored them. Society columns wrote about them in the language reserved for legacy and promise. The future of the modern South. Power, elegance, and purpose. A marriage that represents progress. Simone learned early that in Charleston, admiration was a currency, and she and Grant were considered extraordinarily wealthy. He was the heir to a coastal development empire, old money reshaped into new ambition. Grant moved through rooms with the relaxed certainty of a man who had never had to question whether he belonged. He knew which senators to greet by their first names, which donors preferred bourbon over wine, which board members needed to be flattered before they would approve a project. Simone, on the other hand, did not belong to Charleston by inheritance. She arrived by excellence. A cardiothoracic surgeon with hands steady enough to stop time inside an operating room. Founder of a community heart clinic on the east side, where the waiting rooms were always full and the funding never quite enough. She had built her reputation the way her mother built a life, through endurance, precision, and a refusal to be anything less than exceptional. Together, they were not just a couple, they were a narrative. At charity galas, Grant would lift his glass and say, "None of this would be possible without my wife, the brilliant Dr. Simone Hart." Applause would follow. Simone would smile, graceful, practiced. What the room never noticed was that he spoke of her the way men speak of a landmark, something impressive, something that enhanced the view, something that made his presence feel more significant. Their home had been featured in Southern Living twice. The article called it a study in balance. In the photographs, Simone stood in the kitchen wearing soft cream cashmere, a bowl of lemons arranged beside her like a still life painting. Grant leaned against the counter, sleeves rolled to the elbows, laughing at something the journalist had said. The caption read, "For Grant and Simone, partnership is the foundation of everything." Simone remembered the moment the photo was taken. The photographer had asked her to tilt her chin slightly toward Grant. More connected, he said. She had moved closer. Grant's hand had tightened at her waist. Not painfully, not even noticeably, just enough to guide her into the exact position that looked best for the camera. Later, when the magazine arrived, everyone praised how natural they looked. Natural. That word followed Simone everywhere. Natural elegance, natural chemistry, a natural fit. It never occurred to anyone to ask how much effort it took to become something that appeared that seamless. At the hospital, she was Dr. Hart, the surgeon whose name families whispered with hope in waiting rooms. The woman who could command a surgical team with a single look. At Holloway events, she became Simone, softened voice, measured laughter, the version of herself that made donors feel comfortable with the idea of change without ever feeling challenged by it. Grant used to say she had a gift. "You make people feel at ease," he would tell her. kissing her temple before they stepped into a ballroom. You make them see what I see. At the beginning of their marriage, she believed that meant he saw all of her. The nights when they lay in bed in their first house, before the features and the foundations and the board seats, he would trace the line of her shoulder and talk about the future as if they were building it together. We're going to change this city, he had said once, his voice thick with conviction. You and me. Back then, Simone had thought the "and" meant something. Years later, she began to notice how the sentence had shifted. At a development announcement on the waterfront, Grant stood at the podium while she sat at the table behind him. We're bringing new life to Charleston, he declared. When he gestured toward her, it was with the open-palmed pride of a man displaying proof of his own evolution. My wife keeps me grounded, he said. Grounded. The audience laughed softly. Charmed, Simone smiled, because she always smiled. Afterward, a woman in pearls took her hand and said, "You're so articulate. Grant must be very proud." Simone thanked her. In the car on the way home, she stared out at the harbor lights and told herself that pride was a kind of love. Their marriage had a rhythm. Sunday brunch at the club, fundraisers in spring, the summer benefit on Sullivan's Island, Christmas cards shot in front of the staircase. Grant had a way of reaching for her in public. A hand at her back, fingers brushing her elbow, gestures that looked like intimacy to everyone watching. And for a long time, they were. He used to look at her as if she were the axis his world turned on. In those early years, when she walked into a room in a gown the color of midnight, his expression would shift, just slightly, like a man who had suddenly remembered something essential. "You're extraordinary," he would whisper in her ear. She carried those words for years. She carried them through the long nights at the hospital when she came home to an empty side of the bed. Through the dinners where she listened to conversations about land and legacy that never once mentioned the people displaced by those developments. Through the subtle, constant work of being the bridge between Grant's world and the one she refused to abandon. Because love, Simone believed, was a form of translation. You learned each other's languages. You softened your edges. You made space. Charleston called them perfect because perfection is easier to accept than complexity. They were photographed on the steps of City Hall the day Grant's latest project was approved. Her in white, him in navy, their hands linked. The Holloways, a union of vision and heart, the headline read. Simone remembered how heavy her hand had felt in his, not because she wanted to pull away, but because she had begun, without quite knowing when, to feel like a symbol in a story that was no longer entirely hers. Still, she played her part. She hosted the dinners. She wrote the checks. She stood beside him in rooms where her presence made everything look more progressive, more humane, more complete. When Grant introduced her, it was always with a flourish. "My wife," he would say, his voice warm with possession and admiration. "The best decision I ever made." The room would laugh. Simone would smile. And somewhere inside that smile lived the belief, quiet, stubborn, enduring, that the performance was real because the love had been real. That the brand they had built together was not a fabrication, but an evolution. That the life they had curated, the house, the foundation, the marriage, was not a stage set, but a home. Perfection, after all, is most convincing when you help create it. And Simone had helped create every inch of theirs. Perfection, Simone would later understand, never collapses all at once. It thins, it loosens at the seams. It begins with moments so small they feel almost impolite to notice. At first, it was the way Grant stopped looking at her when she entered a room. Not deliberately, not with cruelty, but with the absent ease of a man who assumes presence is permanent. In their early years, his attention had been immediate, instinctive. She would step into a ballroom and his gaze would find her before anyone else's did, as if the entire evening had been arranged around that single point of recognition. Now, she could cross a crowded terrace and reach his side before he lifted his eyes from his phone. "Just a second," he would murmur, thumb still moving across the screen, his body angled slightly away from her. Just a second. The phrase became a rhythm in their marriage, soft, harmless, endlessly repeatable. At dinner with investors, he began finishing her sentences, not incorrectly, never in a way that would embarrass her, but in a way that gently redirected the focus back toward himself. Simone would begin explaining the long-term health impact of the low-income housing displacement near one of his projects, the strain on emergency rooms, the rise in untreated cardiac conditions, and Grant would lean forward with a warm smile and say, "What Simone means is that community wellness is at the heart of our mission." Our mission, the table would nod. The donors would beam. And her data, the late nights, the research, the patients whose names she still remembered, would dissolve into a single, elegant sentence that belonged to him. Afterward, in the car, he would squeeze her knee. "You were brilliant," he'd say. "You always are." And because his voice was still tender, because his hand was still familiar, she would tell herself it didn't matter, that this was what partnership looked like. Shared language, shared victories. At the hospital, she remained Dr. Hart. In those rooms, her authority was unquestioned. Residents stepped aside when she spoke. Nurses watched her hands the way musicians watch a conductor. Her name on a surgical schedule changed the entire tone of a morning. But at the Holloway Foundation's spring luncheon, a woman she had known for years asked her, "Do you ever miss working full-time? Or is this more flexible for you?" Simone had paused, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. "I operate 4 days a week," she said. The woman blinked, surprised. "Oh, I just assumed with all the events in Grant's schedule." Simone smiled. "Because correcting people in Charleston was an art form. You did it without ever making them feel wrong." Grant never heard those conversations. Or if he did, he laughed them off. "They don't mean anything," he would say. "It's just how they talk. It's just how they talk." The phrase settled into her like fine dust. There were other things. The way his mother still introduced her as "our Simone," the possessive, softened by a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The way Grant's colleagues asked him for her opinion, even when she was standing directly beside him. "Grant, what does Simone think about the clinic expansion?" Grant would turn to her, translating her own thoughts back into the conversation as if they had passed through him first. Simone told herself it was habit, that he was proud of her, that this was visibility. Love, after all, required patience. The first time she noticed the phone, it felt almost accidental. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, sunlight on the marble counters, coffee brewing, the house still wrapped in that brief, gentle quiet before the day began. Grant's phone lay on the table between them, lighting up with a message. He reached for it and turned it face down in one smooth movement. "So," he said, too quickly, "what time do we need to leave for the Peterson brunch?" The motion was small, almost elegant. Simone didn't question it, not then. Because there were 100 reasonable explanations. Because she trusted him. Because suspicion to her felt like a kind of failure. Weeks later, it happened again. They were at Sullivan's Island for the summer benefit, standing near the edge of the water where the air smelled of salt and expensive sunscreen. Grant was laughing with 2 developers when his phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at the screen, and for a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted. Not guilt, not even secrecy, just a flicker of focus that did not include her. He stepped away to take the call. "I'll be right back," he said. Simone watched him walk down the path toward the dunes, his back to her, his voice low. When he returned, he kissed her temple. "Sorry, work." The word covered everything in their world. It covered late nights and canceled dinners and trips, extended by one more day. It covered the slow rearranging of priorities that no one ever named. She began to notice how often his travel overlapped with her longest surgical days, how he was always gone when she was too exhausted to ask for more than sleep. "You're saving lives," he would tell her. "You don't need me hovering around." It sounded like respect. It felt like distance. The compliments changed too. Once he had praised her mind, the way she dismantled an argument, the precision of her reasoning, the quiet force of her presence in a room. Now his admiration arrived in softer form. "You looked beautiful tonight. That dress is perfect on you. You make everything feel so polished." as if she were a surface, as if the depth he had once loved had become a reflection. Simone told herself this was what time did to love, that passion settled into comfort. That comfort sometimes looked like distraction. She told herself this while adjusting her schedule to attend another foundation dinner, while rewriting her clinic proposal to align with one of Grant's development timelines, while learning, without ever speaking it aloud, how to make her brilliance quieter in rooms where his needed to be the loudest. The realization did not arrive as pain. It arrived as fatigue, a particular kind, the kind that comes from carrying something invisible for too long. One evening, months before the receipt, they attended a private dinner at the home of a state senator. Simone wore a deep green gown that made her skin glow like burnished copper. When she stepped out of the car, she waited for the familiar shift, for Grant to look at her the way he used to, with that quick intake of breath that felt like recognition. He glanced at her, smiled, and said, "Perfect. They're going to love this." This, not you. Inside, the night unfolded as always. Laughter, speeches, the careful exchange of influence. At one point, Simone began telling a story about a patient who had walked into her clinic after months without treatment because he had been displaced by rising rents near the hospital. The table leaned in, drawn by her voice. Grant touched her arm, lightly. "We're actually working on a solution for that," he said, turning the focus toward his latest project. The conversation shifted. Simone finished her wine and told herself it was nothing, because the truth was too quiet to name. The quiet disrespect. Not the kind that shouts, not the kind that leaves bruises, the kind that rearranges the center of a life by millimeters at a time. The kind that teaches a woman to doubt her own perception because nothing is ever wrong enough to confront. And in that space, between what she felt and what she could prove, her instincts began to learn the language of silence. The night the receipt appeared, nothing in the house announced that anything had changed. The air conditioning hummed with the same discreet efficiency. The lamps cast the same amber pools of light across the living room. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a carriage passed on Meeting Street. The slow clip of hooves softened by distance. Simone had come home later than usual, the faint, sterile scent of the hospital still clinging to her skin beneath her perfume. A 12-hour surgery had left her body moving on memory rather than energy. Muscle following instruction, breath following discipline. The kind of exhaustion that didn't ask for comfort, only quiet. Grant was upstairs, his voice drifting down in fragments as he spoke on the phone. Warm, confident, persuasive. The voice he used for investors, for donors, for the men who believed in his vision, and the women who admired the way he spoke about it. Simone set her bag on the console and slipped off her heels, her toes pressing into the cool marble floor. For a moment she stood there, eyes closed, letting the silence of the house settle around her like water. Then she noticed the jacket. It lay across the back of a chair in the dining room. Navy, tailored, one of the suits he wore for midweek meetings. Grant was meticulous about his clothes. He never left them behind carelessly. She reached for it without thinking, intending only to hang it properly. The fabric was still faintly warm from his body. And then, the sound. Paper shifting inside an inner pocket. Simone almost didn't check. There was nothing suspicious in the gesture itself. Wives moved their husbands' things every day, straightening, folding, preserving the illusion of order. The intimacy of shared space made the act invisible. She slid her fingers into the pocket and pulled out a small, folded slip. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper, the kind boutique hotels used when they wanted even their receipts to feel like part of an experience. The logo at the top was understated. The address beneath it was not. Savannah, Georgia. A date, a room number, a total, no name. For a moment, the world did not break. There was no cinematic shatter, no dramatic intake of breath. The house remained exactly as it had been. Simone stood in the dining room with the receipt in her hand and felt something inside her shift with the quiet precision of a lock turning. Savannah, 3 hours away, midweek. She read the date again, a Wednesday, her longest surgical day. Grant had told her that morning he would be in Columbia for a zoning meeting. The details aligned so easily in her mind, it frightened her. Not because they proved anything, but because they did not. A business meeting, a client, a booking error. There were 100 explanations that could dissolve this into nothing. Simone folded the paper once, then again. The movement was instinctive, the same careful compression she used when closing a surgical incision, bringing edges together so neatly that the scar would barely exist. Upstairs, Grant laughed at something the person on the phone had said. The sound drifted down, familiar, intimate. Simone slid the receipt into the inside pocket of her own coat. Not hidden, not displayed, filled. Her reflection in the dark window caught her attention. The black dress she had worn to the hospital, the delicate gold chain at her throat, the face that Charleston recognized from charity galas and foundation boards. Composed, impenetrable. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady, her pulse exactly where it should be. Grant came down a few minutes later, still loosening his cufflinks. "There you are," he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. "How was the surgery?" "Long," she replied. "Successful?" "Yes. I knew it would be." His hand rested briefly at the small of her back, the same gesture the cameras loved. "I'm proud of you." The words were familiar, so was the warmth in his voice. He moved past her to the refrigerator, talking about a dinner next week, about a donor who needed convincing, about a trip he might have to take, just for a day, nothing major. Simone watched him as he spoke. Watched the ease of his movements, the unguarded way he poured himself bourbon, the complete absence of tension in his shoulders. If there had been anything to confess, anything to hide, it was not visible. He turned back to her with that smile, the one that had once undone her completely. "You look exhausted," he said. "Come upstairs, I'll run you a bath." For a moment, a single, dangerous moment, she wanted to hand him the receipt, to place it between them and watch his face change, to ask a question that had only just been born. But she had spent her life in operating rooms. She knew the difference between impulse and precision. And this, whatever it was, required precision. Later in the bathroom, steam rising around her as she sank into the water he had drawn, Simone closed her eyes and replayed the date in her mind. Wednesday, Savannah, no name. She thought of the hours she had stood over an open chest that day, her hands inside a stranger's body, holding a human heart between life and silence. She thought of the text Grant had sent that afternoon. Meeting running late. Don't wait up. The language of their marriage had always been built on trust. Schedules shared. Locations known. Lives that moved in parallel, intersecting with intention. This small, elegant piece of paper introduced a new grammar. Not accusation, not proof. Possibility. When she stepped out of the bath, Grant was already in bed, reading emails on his phone. He looked up and smiled. "Come here," he said, pulling the covers back. She slipped in beside him, her body fitting into the familiar curve of his. He kissed her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. "I missed you today." Simone lay there in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as it slowed towards sleep. Her hand rested lightly on his chest, over the steady beat of his heart. A surgeon's hand, a woman's hand, the hand that had held the receipt and folded it without trembling. In the darkness, she opened her eyes. The ceiling above them was the same. The room was the same. The man beside her was the same. And yet something had entered the space between them, small, silent, and irreversible. A first object, an artifact without a name. On the chair across the room, her coat hung where she had left it. Inside its pocket, the receipt waited, not as evidence, not yet, but as the beginning of a new way of seeing. After the receipt, nothing changed, which was how Simone knew everything had. Grant still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, his hand warm at the back of her neck, the scent of his cologne settling into the air like something permanent. He still sent her messages in the middle of the day, brief, affectionate, threaded with the easy intimacy of a man who believed in the continuity of his own life. "Lunch when you're done saving the world? Miss you already. A donor dinner tonight. Don't wait up." The language of their marriage remained flawless. It was the timing that began to fracture. Simone did not look for the cracks immediately. She moved through her days with the same precision she always had, Surgeries scheduled to the minute, patient charts reviewed in the quiet hour before dawn, meetings at the clinic that required her full attention. But the receipt had altered the way time felt. Wednesday no longer existed as a single point in the week. It became a pattern, a rhythm, a question. The first almost slip came at the Hollingsworth Maritime Gala, one of the season's most anticipated events. A night of white silk and orchestras and donors whose last names were older than most American cities. Simone wore silver that evening, a gown that caught the light like water. Grant stood beside her at the entrance, greeting guests with the effortless charm that had built his empire. "You're dazzling," he murmured in her ear. The words were right. The tone was right. Everything about him was right. And yet, halfway through the evening, as they stood near the terrace where the harbor shimmered beyond the balustrade, Grant's phone vibrated in his hand. Simone felt it more than she saw it. The shift in his posture, the way his shoulders angled away from her, the way his smile paused for a fraction of a second before returning. He glanced down. A message. For a moment, his expression emptied of the room. Then he locked the screen. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Work, work." The word fell between them like a familiar refrain. She watched him walk toward the far end of the terrace, where the shadows softened the outlines of the guests, and the music blurred into something distant. He turned his back to the crowd as he spoke, his voice low. Simone did not follow. She lifted her champagne glass and listened to the woman beside her talk about a new preservation project downtown. She nodded at the appropriate moments, her responses measured, her smile perfectly placed. But her gaze moved, not directly, never directly, toward the reflection in the glass doors. Grant's hand rested on the railing as he spoke into the phone. His head tilted slightly, the way it did when he was listening intently. He laughed once, a quiet, private sound she had not heard all evening. When he returned, he slid his arm around her waist. "Sorry," he said. "Investor in Atlanta. Time zones." Atlanta. Simone let the word settle. She knew his schedule. Atlanta had been yesterday, not tonight. The lie did not announce itself. It did not arrive as shock or even as hurt. It arrived as a misalignment. A note in a familiar melody played just slightly off-key. She turned her face toward him, her expression serene. "How is the project going?" she asked. He answered without hesitation, his voice smooth, his details precise. Too precise. Grant had always been a man of confident generalities, big visions, broad strokes. Tonight he spoke in specifics that sounded rehearsed, like a speech given in a room that required proof. Simone listened. She listened the way she listened to a patient describing symptoms that did not match the test results. With patience, with stillness, with the knowledge that the truth was not in the words themselves, but in the space around them. Later on the drive home, the city quiet beyond the windshield, Grant reached for her hand. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "Was I?" she replied. "Just a little. Everything okay?" He sounded genuinely concerned. That was the part that might have broken someone else. Grant did not behave like a guilty man. He behaved like a man who believed his life was intact. "I'm tired," Simone said. "Long day." He lifted her hand to his lips. "You worked too hard." At a red light, she turned her head and looked at him. The familiar profile, the same strong line of his jaw, the same mouth that had once whispered promises into her skin as if they were prayers. It would have been so easy to believe him. At home, as they moved through their nightly rituals, his bourbon, her tea, the quiet exchange of schedules for the next day, Simone watched him with a new kind of attention. Not suspicion, observation. He spoke about a zoning meeting in Columbia for the following Wednesday. She knew, from years of shared calendars and overlapping commitments, that there was no meeting scheduled. He had told the lie before he needed it. He had built the alibi in advance. That was the moment the shift inside her became irreversible. Because a lie told in response to a question could be impulse. A lie prepared ahead of time was architecture. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked lightly. "Make a day of it. We could have dinner after." It was such a generous offer, so perfectly timed. Simone smiled. "I have surgery," she said. "You know that." "Right," he replied, as if he had forgotten. But he had not forgotten. He had known. The next Wednesday, she watched the clock in the operating room with a calm that surprised her. Her hands moved with their usual certainty. Her voice remained steady as she instructed the residents. Inside, she measured time differently. At 10:14 a.m., her phone, locked in her bag across the room, would be receiving the message she already knew by heart. Meeting starting. Talk tonight. At 10:16, she would be making the first incision. Precision. Control. After the surgery, she did not check her phone immediately. She removed her gloves, washed her hands, and walked through the corridor lined with families waiting for news. Only when she reached her office did she open the screen. The message was there, exactly as expected. Meeting starting. Talk tonight. Simone sat down at her desk and stared at the words. Then she opened the shared calendar. Columbia, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. She closed it. There was no anger, not yet. There was something colder, a recognition. The lie had slipped, not because it was poorly told, but because it had been told so often it had begun to repeat itself. Patterns. In medicine, patterns were everything. A single anomaly could be dismissed. A recurring one was a diagnosis. That evening, when Grant came home, he carried a small white box from her favorite bakery. "For you," he said, "because I know Wednesdays are brutal." He kissed her, his mouth sweet with the taste of the frosting he had sampled on the drive. "How was Columbia?" she asked, her tone light, conversational. "Long," he said. "Productive. They're finally moving on the permit." The answer came without a pause, without a shift in his breathing, without a single visible crack. Simone opened the box and cut the cake into 2 perfect slices. They ate at the kitchen counter, talking about nothing, laughing once or twice, the performance flawless. Later, as she stood at the sink, rinsing the plates, Grant came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You're the best part of my life," he said into her hair. She closed her eyes. For years, she had believed those words were the center of everything. Now they felt like a line delivered in a room she had already left. In the reflection of the dark window above the sink, she saw them standing together. The perfect couple Charleston admired, his arms around her, her body leaning back into his. A portrait of continuity. And between them, invisible to everyone but her, the space where the lie had slipped through and settled, quiet and permanent, like a fault line beneath a house that had not yet begun to shake. The name did not arrive with thunder. It appeared the way most irreversible things in Simone's life had, quietly, with the soft authority of fact. By then, the receipt had been joined by others. Not identical, not obvious, but enough to form a pattern when laid side by side on the desk in her private office at the clinic. Long after the last patient had gone home, and the city had folded itself into evening. Savannah, the same hotel, different dates, always Wednesdays. Simone did not look at them as a wife. She looked at them as a surgeon reads imaging before an operation, searching not for the emotional weight of the diagnosis, but for its structure, location, frequency, time, the anatomy of a hidden life. It was the rideshare history that gave her the address, not because she had been searching for it. She told herself that she was only checking the account for a reimbursement error, that the charge for a trip she had never taken needed to be corrected. The mind, she had learned, was capable of building entire architectures of reason to protect itself from a single, undeniable truth. The destination appeared in a neat column of data. Meeting Street to the parking garage. The parking garage to the interstate. The interstate to a narrow street near the river in Savannah. Repeated. Measured. Unmistakable. Simone stared at the screen for a long time before she moved. Her office was dim, except for the desk lamp, its light falling in a circle that made everything beyond it disappear. She wrote the address down on a blank page, not in the looping handwriting she used for thank you notes and holiday cards, in the precise, controlled script she used in medical charts. Evidence. She did not go to Savannah. She did not need to. The world, in its endless willingness to reveal itself, had already provided everything. The building appeared first, a converted warehouse, exposed brick, wide windows that looked out over the water. The kind of place featured in lifestyle magazines under headings like industrial elegance and the new Southern creative class. Then the name on the mailbox, Lane. Whitney Lane. It was a common enough name. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it meant nothing. Then came the image. A photograph from a charity event Simone had attended the previous spring, not as a guest, but as a keynote speaker for a panel on community health funding. The article had been about the donors and the young professionals shaping the future of Charleston's cultural scene. Simone had been in the background of one of the photos, half turned, her attention on the moderator. In the foreground, laughing into the camera, was a woman in a white dress. Blonde, radiant, holding a champagne glass in one hand as if it were part of her body. The caption read, "Whitney Lane, brand strategist and founder of Lane Creative, brings a fresh voice to Southern luxury marketing." Simone did not feel the sharpness she had expected. No immediate wound, no jealousy that burned. Instead, there was a strange, almost clinical curiosity. She opened another window. Whitney Lane had an online presence the way some women had a signature scent. Consistent, curated, unmistakable. Instagram, a study in light. White interiors, soft neutrals. Flowers in vases that looked as though they had never wilted. Her face appeared again and again, tilted toward the camera with an ease that suggested she had never once questioned her own place in the world. She was younger than Simone had imagined. 28, perhaps 29. The kind of beauty that did not try to dominate a room, but allowed the room to rearrange itself around her. Her captions spoke of intention, of storytelling, of building a life you don't need a vacation from. Simone paused on a photograph taken at Sullivan's Island. Whitney stood at the edge of the water, her dress caught by the wind, the horizon stretching endlessly behind her. The date, a Wednesday. Simone knew where she had been that day. In an operating room for 9 hours, her hands deep inside a stranger's chest, holding a human heart between her fingers and guiding it back toward life. Grant had sent her a message that afternoon. Long meeting. Wish you were here. She studied Whitney's face, not searching for flaws, not comparing. There was nothing in that face that diminished her. Nothing that made Simone feel less. And that was when the realization came. Not as pain, but as a slow, almost reverent understanding. This was not about beauty, not about youth, not about something she lacked. This was about narrative. Whitney's life, displayed in carefully filtered squares, resembled the early years of Simone's marriage. The curated dinners, the carefully lit mornings, the language of partnership and creation, the sense of being chosen. Simone recognized it because she had lived it. The difference was that Whitney believed she was at the beginning of the story. Simone knew what the middle looked like. She scrolled further. There were no photographs of Grant. Not directly, but there were traces. A man's hand in the corner of a table. A watch Simone had bought for her husband for their 8th anniversary. A blurred reflection in a restaurant window. A glass raised in a toast across from hers. Nothing that could be called proof. Everything that formed a pattern. Whitney's captions spoke of gratitude, of alignment, of building something meaningful with someone who saw her vision. Simone sat back in her chair. For the first time since the receipt, she allowed herself to close her eyes. In the darkness behind them, images overlapped. Her own younger self in a small apartment in Boston, studying through the night while Grant slept beside her, his arm thrown across her waist, as if he could not imagine a future that did not include her. The first charity gala where he had introduced her as the most extraordinary woman in the room, the way she had believed him. Whitney's smile on the screen, bright, certain, unquestioning. Simone did not hate her. Hatred required a kind of emotional investment she was no longer willing to give. Instead, she felt something more complicated, a quiet, aching recognition. This was the woman who had stepped into the space Simone had once occupied, the space where Grant's attention was new, where his admiration felt like oxygen, where every shared plan seemed like a promise rather than a negotiation. She opened Whitney's website, brand storytelling for legacy clients, helping established names reach new audiences. Simone almost laughed. Of course, the woman who built narratives for a living had become part of one. She closed the laptop. The room returned. The muted light, the stack of patient files, the steady hum of the clinic's night security system. On the desk beside her lay the receipt, the address, the dates. Now the name, Whitney Lane. For the first time, the hidden life had a face, not a faceless betrayal, not an abstract possibility. A woman who woke in the mornings and chose a dress and believed in the life she was living. Simone stood and walked to the window. Charleston stretched below her, the same city that had celebrated her marriage, that had turned her into a symbol, that had applauded the brand she and Grant had built together. The lights along the harbor trembled in the water. She thought of the 3 plates on the dining table that did not yet exist, of the moment that was already forming somewhere in the future, of the space between what had been and what would be. Behind her, on the desk, the name waited, not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as the final piece of a structure that had been assembling itself in silence. Simone touched the glass of the window, her reflection superimposed over the city. Whitney Lane, she said aloud, testing the sound of it. It did not break her. It did not even hurt. It clarified. And in that clarity, something inside her, something that had been bending for years, became perfectly, immovably still. Simone did not confront him, not when she learned the name, not when the second receipt surfaced, then the third, then the fourth, each one separated by exactly 7 days, as precise as a surgical schedule. Confrontation belonged to emotion. She had entered a different discipline. Evidence. Her private office at the clinic became a place that no longer belonged to medicine. By day, it was the room where families were told that a procedure had gone well, where fear softened into gratitude beneath her calm voice. By night, it transformed into something quieter, colder, a chamber of assembly. She did not call it an investigation. She called it organization. The first folder was cream, the kind used for patient histories. On the tab, she wrote in clean, deliberate script, Exhibit A, timeline. Dates aligned in a vertical column. Wednesdays, every Wednesday for 18 months. Beside each one, 2 notations. Her schedule. His. The overlap was flawless. On the days she performed her longest surgeries, the ones that began before dawn and ended long after sunset, Grant's calendar showed development meetings, out-of-town site reviews, donor consultations. Absences that had once felt like the natural cost of ambition now formed a pattern so exact it might have been drawn with a ruler. She traced the line down the page with the tip of her pen, not shaking, never shaking. In the operating room, her hands had learned to move inside the narrowest margins of life. This required the same stillness. The second folder was dark. Exhibit B, movement. Rideshare histories printed and highlighted. Garage entries, toll records, fuel charges. Every path led south. Every return arrived just before midnight. There was a particular elegance in the consistency. He had not been careless. Careless men left chaos. Grant had left symmetry. Simone paused at one entry, a ride that ended 20 minutes later than usual. The same night he had come home and woken her with a kiss at the edge of sleep. Missed you. The memory surfaced with sensory precision. The warmth of his mouth, the faint scent of unfamiliar soap on his skin, the way she had turned toward him automatically, her body answering a language it had spoken for a decade. She wrote a note beside the time. Physical contact after return, not accusation, observation. The third folder was the thinnest. Exhibit C, language. This one had surprised her because it was not made of numbers or receipts. It was made of words, messages, emails, phrases repeated over months with subtle variation. Running late. Meeting went longer than expected. Wish you were here. Next week will be easier. They had once sounded like love. Now they read like a script. She laid the printed pages side by side and saw it. The rhythm, the recurring cadence, the emotional punctuation. He had been speaking to 2 women in parallel. Not the same sentences, never that obvious, but the same architecture of reassurance. The same promise of future time, the same careful management of absence. Simone leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. For years, she had believed that intimacy meant understanding someone's patterns, the way he preferred his coffee, the precise angle at which he loosened his tie at the end of the day, the silence he carried when something at work had unsettled him. She had studied him with the devotion of a woman who thought knowledge was protection. Now she saw that she had been reading only one column of a two-column text. The realization did not wound. It refined. On her desk, the folders lay in a clean row. A, B, C, the structure of proof. In medical school, she had learned that diagnosis was not a single discovery, but the convergence of multiple indicators. One symptom meant nothing. Three formed a condition. She stood and walked to the small cabinet where she kept surgical models for patient consultations. Plastic hearts, arteries, cross-sections of lungs. She lifted the heart model and turned it in her hands. Inside its chambers, pathways connected and separated with mechanical clarity. Blood moved in a single direction. Order. When something disrupted that order, the entire system compensated until it couldn't. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Grant, dinner on Friday? Just us. It's been too long. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she opened the calendar and scrolled back. Friday. 18 months of Fridays. Charity events, board meetings, dinners with donors, always in public, always together. Their marriage had two lives, one displayed, one hidden, and she had been the guardian of the displayed one. She typed back, "I'd like that." The answer was not a lie. She would like it, because by then, she would know everything. In the weeks that followed, the collection continued with the quiet inevitability of time. A credit card charge for a restaurant in Savannah, the same restaurant appearing in Whitney's photographs. A florist delivery that never reached their house. A reservation under an initial that matched Grant's middle name. Each piece entered its place. No drama, no hesitation. She did not cry. Tears belonged to the moment of revelation. She had passed that threshold. This was construction. The night she finished, the clinic was so silent she could hear the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. She arranged the folders in a single stack. Not thick, not overwhelming, precise. She opened the first one again and read the heading. Exhibit A, Timeline. Below it, the column of Wednesdays. A year and a half of parallel lives. She placed her hand flat on the page. In the operating room, this was the moment before incision. The pause. The breath. The absolute certainty of where to cut. Simone did not feel anger. Anger would have suggested that she had lost control. She felt something far more dangerous. Authority. Not over him. Over the narrative. For years, Grant had believed that he was the architect of their shared life. The strategist, the planner, the man who moved pieces across a board she kept polished and presentable. He had never understood that she was a surgeon, that her entire existence was built on entering chaos and leaving order behind. She closed the folder, turned off the desk lamp. The room dissolved into shadow. As she stepped into the hallway, she carried nothing in her hands. Everything that mattered was already complete. Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C. Not weapons, not revenge, proof. And proof, she knew better than anyone, did not need to raise its voice to change a life. Simone did not send the invitations immediately. For 3 days, they remained blank cards, resting in a drawer of her writing desk. Thick ivory stock edged with the faintest line of gold. The kind reserved for occasions that were meant to be remembered. Weddings, anniversaries, galas where people wore their lives like tailored fabric. She had chosen them months earlier, before she knew that the date printed at the top would become something else entirely. Now they waited in the dark, absorbing the weight of a decision that had already been made. The house moved around her as it always had. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, turning the hardwood floors into long rivers of honey. The coffee machine hissed at precisely 6:30. Grant's footsteps crossed the hallway in the measured rhythm she had once associated with safety. If there was a difference in her, he did not see it. Or perhaps he saw what he expected to see, the same woman who had stood beside him for 10 years, steady and luminous, the axis around which their shared world turned. "Dinner next Thursday," he said one morning, knotting his tie in the mirror. "Our anniversary, I made a reservation at Larkspur. Simone met his gaze in the reflection. There had been a time when that name would have filled her with warmth. The memory of their first celebration there, the way he had taken her hand across the table and said, "We're just getting started." Now she saw the date for what it was. A frame, a perfect symmetry, a stage. "I thought we could stay home," she said gently. "Just us. Something quieter." He smiled, relieved. "I like that." Of course he did. The illusion of intimacy had always been his favorite setting. That afternoon, after the clinic had emptied and the last of the surgical reports had been filed, Simone returned to the desk. She opened the drawer. The cards lay where she had left them, their surfaces untouched, patient. She took out her fountain pen, the one her mother had given her when she finished residency, engraved with her name in fine script. Simone Carter. The ink flowed in a deep, controlled line. She began with Grant's card, not because he would receive it, because ritual mattered, because marking the moment when she stepped out of one role and into another required an object that could hold a transition. "You are cordially invited to an anniversary dinner. Thursday, 8 o'clock. At home." No signature. But the act of writing it severed something invisible and final. She wrote the name with the same precision she used when entering a patient's details before surgery. Whitney Lane. The letters curved across the paper in calm, impeccable lines. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the path this card would travel. Through the narrow slot of a mailbox in Savannah, into hands that had never touched her life directly, into a space where it would be read with confusion first, then curiosity, and finally something colder. She did not add an explanation. She did not add a threat. The absence of those things was the power. Inside that evening, she drove south, not as a wife following a husband's secret route. Savannah received her in the slow blue hour before night. The river dark and reflective, the air heavy with salt and jasmine. The streets were quieter than Charleston's, their rhythm more languid, as though time moved differently there. The building was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph. Exposed brick, tall windows, light spilling from within. Simone parked across the street and sat for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She did not rehearse what she would say. There was nothing to say. The entire act depended on silence. When she stepped out of the car, the air wrapped around her like velvet. Her heels made almost no sound on the pavement. At the entrance, a young couple passed her, laughing, their hands linked in that unconscious way of people who believed the future was a shared and infinite thing. Simone watched them for a second, not with longing, not with regret, but with a distant recognition of a language she had once spoken fluently. Inside the lobby, the mailboxes lined one wall in precise rows. Lane. The name appeared exactly where she knew it would. She slid the envelope through the narrow opening. The sound it made was almost inaudible. Paper against metal, a whisper, and yet it echoed in her body with the clarity of a closing door. She did not wait. She did not look back. Outside, the night had deepened, the street lamps casting their golden circles on the pavement. On the drive home, she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Not triumph, not dread, space. For months, her life had been occupied by the accumulation of facts, the assembling of proof, the careful containment of a truth that had grown too large to ignore. Now the motion had shifted outward. The next step belonged not to discovery, but to revelation. Grant was already asleep when she returned. His phone lay on the bedside table, its screen dark, its presence as ordinary as it had always been. She moved through the bedroom without turning on the light, changing into a silk robe, her movements slow and deliberate. On her own nightstand, she placed a single object. Not the evidence, not the folders. A fresh set of place cards, 3 of them, blank, waiting. In the darkness, she lay beside him, her body close enough to feel the familiar warmth of his. His arm moved instinctively across her waist, the gesture of a man who believed proximity was permanence. Simone stared at the ceiling. Somewhere, 3 hours away, a woman would return home and find an envelope in her mailbox. She would open it under soft light, her brows drawing together as she read the elegant script. She would read it again and again, trying to locate its meaning, trying to understand how she had been summoned into a life she had never seen. Simone closed her eyes. The house was silent. The city beyond the windows had folded into night. Inside her, everything was still. The invitation had been sent, not as a message, not as a warning, as an event that had already begun to unfold. Velvet silence. Soft, impeccable, irreversible. Grant was lighter. It was the first thing Simone noticed on Monday morning, and once she saw it, she could not unsee it. The looseness in his shoulders, the unguarded rhythm in the way he moved through the kitchen, the soft, almost boyish hum beneath his breath as he poured their coffee. Happier, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone who had not spent a decade studying the language of his body the way she had once studied anatomy, memorizing every small deviation from normal. But the difference was there, subtle, precise, like the faint elevation of a patient's heart rate that signaled something beneath the surface had changed. "You're in a good mood," she said, setting a plate in front of him. He looked up, surprised, as if he had not realized the truth had escaped him. "Big week," he replied easily. "The dockside project is finally moving. Investors are back on board. Feels like everything's lining up again." Everything. The word hovered between them. Simone smiled in the way she had perfected over years. Warm, receptive, the expression that told a room she was present, that she belonged, that nothing was wrong. "I'm glad," she said, and she was. Not for the reasons he believed, but because happiness made people careless. The rest. Grant came home earlier. He brought flowers on Tuesday. White ranunculus, her favorite, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a careless knot that suggested spontaneity. "Just because," he said, pressing his lips to her temple. On Wednesday, the day that had once been his absence, he stayed. Or at least, he made a show of staying. A meeting canceled. A donor rescheduled. "I thought we could have lunch together," he suggested, appearing at the clinic in the middle of her day with takeout from the small Mediterranean place she loved. The nurses watched from the corridor with soft smiles. Dr. Carter's husband, still devoted, still attentive, the story held. They ate in her office, the sunlight cutting across his face in a way that made him look younger, almost like the man she had met in Boston, when everything between them had been possibility and hunger. "You've been working too hard," he said, studying her. "After Thursday, we should get away. Just the two of us. No phones, no commitments." After Thursday, the date moved through her like a current. She reached for her water and nodded. "That sounds nice." He relaxed visibly, as though her agreement had closed a loop inside him. Later that afternoon, one of her colleagues leaned into the doorway, her expression bright with approval. "You two are the gold standard," she said. "Seriously, 10 years and he still looks at you like that?" Simone followed her gaze through the glass wall of her office. Grant stood in the hallway speaking to a hospital administrator, his hand resting lightly on the small of Simone's back, as if it belonged there by right. Possession, protection, performance. The three had always been indistinguishable to the outside world. "He's proud of you," her colleague added. "You can tell." Simone inclined her head. She did not correct her. By Thursday morning, the house itself seemed to participate in the illusion. Sunlight flooded the dining room earlier than usual, catching the polished surface of the table and turning it into a mirror. The house manager moved quietly through the space, setting linens, arranging the lilies Simone had ordered the day before. "3 place settings, Dr. Carter?" she asked, her voice careful, neutral. Simone met her eyes. "Yes." No further explanation was required. Some people recognized the storm before the air shifted. Grant called twice that day, once just to say he was thinking about it. "I can't wait for tonight," he told her. "It's been a long time since we've had a real evening together." A real evening. She repeated the phrase in her mind as she drove home. The city passed in its usual procession of familiar streets and storefronts. Every detail exactly as it had always been. Nothing in the world had changed. Only the meaning. At home, she dressed slowly, not in the red dress he loved, not in the soft blues he once said made her look approachable. She chose black silk, the cut architectural, the fabric falling cleanly along her body like armor disguised as elegance. In the mirror, she saw not the wife the city knew, but the woman who had assembled Exhibit A, B, C with a surgeon's discipline. Her phone lit up on the vanity. Grant, running a little late. Site meeting went long. Be there by 8. She read the message once. Then she opened the location app. The small blue dot moved across the map. Not toward the office, not toward any development site, toward the highway, south. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the ghost of what that lie would have done to her a year ago. The tightening in her chest, the automatic search for reasons to believe him, the gentle self-correction that had been her second nature. Now it passed through her without resistance. By 7:30, the table was set. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 folded napkins resting like small, silent promises. The candles were unlit, their wicks waiting. The house held its breath. At 7:43, the doorbell rang. The sound moved through the hallway with a clarity that seemed almost ceremonial. Simone did not hurry. She walked to the door with the same measured pace she used when entering an operating room. When she opened it, Whitney Lane stood on the threshold. She looked younger in person, less composed, her hair pulled back in a style that had not survived the humidity of the evening, a few loose strands clinging to her temples. In her hand, the invitation, the paper slightly bent from being held too tightly. "Dr. Carter?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Simone smiled. "Please," she said softly, stepping aside. "Call me Simone." Whitney hesitated for only a fraction of a second before crossing the threshold. Inside, the air shifted. The lilies filled the room with their thick, almost suffocating sweetness. Whitney's eyes moved over the space, the art, the staircase, the long hallway that led toward the dining room. Recognition began to bloom in her expression, not of the house, of the truth. Simone gestured toward the table. "Dinner will be ready soon." Whitney followed her into the room and stopped. The 3 place settings gleamed under the low light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Footsteps approached the front of the house. Grant's voice, warm and unguarded, carried down the hallway. "Simone, I'm home." Simone took her seat at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on either side of her plate. Across from her, Whitney lowered herself into the chair, as if her body no longer belonged to her. The candles remained unlit, the air thick with anticipation. In the hallway, Grant's footsteps slowed. He was still smiling when he appeared in the doorway. And for a fraction of a second, the smallest measurable unit of time, his happiness remained intact. Before it saw the third plate, Whitney did not belong to the architecture of Simone's life. And yet she stood in the center of it, framed by the doorway, the warm light of the foyer falling over her shoulders, as if the house itself were trying to understand how she had entered. For a moment, neither woman moved. The air held the kind of stillness that exists in an operating room just before the first incision. When every instrument is in place, when every possibility has been calculated, when the body on the table has not yet understood what is about to change. Whitney clutched her bag with both hands, the invitation folded inside it like a fragile piece of evidence. I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice soft, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to navigating unfamiliar spaces with charm rather than fear. Simone closed the door behind her. The sound was gentle, final. "There hasn't," she replied. Her voice carried no sharpness. That, more than anything, unsettled Whitney, because anger would have given her something to resist. Kindness, measured, composed, deliberate, removed every defense. "Come in," Simone said. Whitney stepped forward. The movement was hesitant at first, then automatic, the way people move when they do not yet know that retreat is no longer an option. The foyer opened into the long corridor that led to the dining room. The house revealed itself in layers. The oil painting Grant had insisted on buying at their 5th anniversary auction. The narrow console table where Simone left her surgical gloves when she came home late. The framed photograph from the hospital's foundation gala. Simone in black, Grant at her side, both of them looking toward a future that had once felt like a single direction. Whitney's gaze moved over each detail with growing comprehension. Not curiosity, recognition. "You live here," she said, the words barely audible. Yes. The simplicity of the answer settled between them like a weight. Whitney's hand rose to her throat, as though something inside her had shifted and she needed to steady it. I thought this was about a project, she said. A consultation. I didn't know. Simone did not interrupt her. She allowed the sentence to collapse under its own unfinished truth. The dining room waited at the end of the hallway. When they entered, Whitney stopped walking. The table was set with a precision that bordered on ceremonial. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 folded napkins. The lilies in the center had opened fully, their scent thick in the air. Whitney's breath caught. Her eyes moved from the first place setting to the second, and then, with a kind of slow, inevitable dread, to the third. For a moment, she swayed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that her body had lost its sense of balance. You invited me, she whispered. Yes. To your anniversary dinner. Yes. The truth did not arrive in a single blow. It assembled itself in her expression. Shock first, then understanding, then something more complex and far more human. Guilt. Simone watched it unfold with the detached focus she had learned in surgery. Not because she was without feeling, but because observation was the only way to remain steady. I didn't know, Whitney said quickly, the words spilling out. I swear to you, I didn't know he was still with you. He told me. Simone raised her hand. The gesture was small, absolute. We will talk, she said softly. But first, sit down. Whitney obeyed. Not because she wanted to, because the authority in Simone's voice made refusal impossible. She lowered herself into the chair opposite Simone, her hands trembling as they touched the edge of the table. Up close, she looked younger than she had in the photographs. The careful composure of her public life had thinned into something raw and unguarded. Her eyes were red at the corners, as if she had not been sleeping well for some time. Simone recognized the signs. The body knew when it was living inside a story that did not align with reality. Does he know I'm here? Whitney asked. No. The answer seemed to remove the last remaining illusion. Whitney pressed her palm against her chest, as though trying to slow the movement of her heart. I would never, she began, then stopped, because the evidence of her presence in that room made the sentence meaningless. Simone studied her, not as a rival, not as an intruder, but as a woman who had been placed inside a narrative she had not written. What did he tell you about me? Simone asked. Whitney looked down at her hands. Her voice, when it came, was smaller. That you were brilliant, she said. That your career came first. That you were distant. That the marriage was over in everything but name. Simone almost smiled. Not from amusement, from recognition. It was a familiar script. The wife transformed into a shadow so that the man could remain the hero of every version of the story. He said he didn't want to hurt you, Whitney added, her eyes filling. That he was waiting for the right time to make it official. That there were things, family, business, that made it complicated. Complicated, Simone repeated. The words settled between them, thin and transparent. Whitney looked up then, meeting Simone's gaze for the first time without flinching. I didn't know, she said again. And this time, Simone believed her. Not because the words were convincing, but because the truth of her confusion, her dawning horror, was too precise to be performed. Simone reached for the place card in front of the third setting. Grant's name was written in the same controlled script she had used on the invitations. She turned it so Whitney could see. He will be here in a few minutes, she said. Whitney's chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back, her body reacting before her mind could form a decision. I can't, she said. I can't be here when he... Yes, Simone replied quietly. You can. There was no threat in the words, only certainty. Whitney froze. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to contract around them. Every sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant movement of traffic outside, became magnified. Why are you doing this? Whitney asked. Simone considered the question, not the surface meaning, the deeper one, because the answer had nothing to do with humiliation, nothing to do with revenge. Because truth requires witnesses, she said. Whitney closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, unguarded, unhidden. I feel like I can't breathe, she whispered. You can, Simone said. You just don't know yet what it feels like to breathe without a lie. In the distance, a car door closed. Both women heard it. The sound moved through the house with the inevitability of a clock striking an hour that had been approaching all along. Whitney's hand reached blindly for the edge of the table. Simone remained perfectly still. Footsteps crossed the foyer. The familiar rhythm, the confident, unhurried pace of a man who believed himself expected and welcomed. Grant's voice carried down the hallway. Simone, I'm home. Whitney's eyes flew to Simone's. In them was a single, shared understanding. There was no longer a version of this evening that could return them to the lives they had been living an hour before. Simone folded her hands in her lap, her posture composed, her breathing even. The woman in her house, the woman across from her, not an enemy, not a stranger, a mirror of a story that was about to end. In the doorway, Grant appeared, smiling, radiant with the ease of a man whose world had not yet shifted. And for the space of a single heartbeat, Simone saw him through Whitney's eyes. Charming, desired, certain. Then his gaze moved to the third chair, and the certainty broke. Grant stopped in the doorway as if the air had turned to glass. For a fraction of a second, his expression held. The familiar warmth, the easy confidence, the smile he wore like a well-cut suit. Then his eyes adjusted. Simone, the table, Whitney, the third place setting. Something inside his face collapsed with such precision that Simone almost admired it. The speed with which recognition moved through him, confusion, calculation, fear, was the same speed she had once seen when a patient's vital signs dropped without warning. Simone, he said, her name breaking apart in his mouth. What is... Sit down, Grant. Her voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It moved through the room with the quiet authority of a command that had never once in its life been ignored. He looked at her then, really looked. Not at the wife who had absorbed his lateness with grace, who had adjusted her life around his schedules, who had believed his explanations because believing had been easier than dismantling the story they shared. At the woman sitting at the head of the table, still immovable. He did not sit immediately. His eyes went to Whitney, as though her presence might be explained by a version of reality he could still control. Whitney, he said, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. I didn't know you were... Sit down, Simone repeated. This time, there was no mistaking it. Grant moved. Not willingly, not with dignity, but with the reflex of someone who had just understood that the rules had changed, and he had not been the one to write them. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he lowered himself into it. For a moment, no one spoke. The candles remained unlit. The lilies had begun to open too far, their perfume turning heavy, almost sweet to the point of decay. Grant's hands rested on the table. Simone watched them. She had known those hands in 1,000 contexts, signing contracts, lifting glasses in toasts, holding her face with what she had once believed was reverence. Now they lay flat against the polished wood, the fingers slightly spread, as though he needed the surface to remind himself that something solid still existed. I can explain, he said. The phrase arrived exactly as she had expected it. Not because he was unoriginal, because it was the only language he knew for this moment. Simone smiled. It was not the smile he had fallen in love with. It was the one she used in courtrooms when opposing counsel offered a weak argument. That's the beauty of it, she said softly. For the first time in 10 years, I don't need your explanations. Whitney's breath hitched. Grant turned to her, desperation beginning to show beneath the composure he was trying to rebuild. Whitney, No, Simone said. One word. Enough. He fell silent. She reached beside her chair and lifted 2 envelopes onto the table. They were thick, impeccably organized. He stared at them as if they were alive. This, she said, resting her fingers lightly on the first one, is the complete record of your affair. The word did not echo. It did not need to. It landed with the weight of fact. Grant's face drained of color. Whitney's hand flew to her mouth. 18 months, Simone continued, every Wednesday, every hotel, every lie, every message you sent from the car on your way back to me. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away. The precision of her tone made the contents of the envelope unnecessary. He knew. He knew exactly how much she knew. "You went through my—" he began, his voice cracking. "I observe patterns," she replied. "It's what I do for a living. When something threatens a life, I study it until I understand its structure." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, heavy with the accumulation of everything that had once been unspoken between them. Grant swallowed. "Simone," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name now, something stripped of the easy ownership it had always carried. "This isn't what it looks like." Whitney turned to him then, slowly. Her eyes were no longer confused. They were clear. "Then what is it?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in the entire length of their marriage, Simone watched Grant Whitmore, the man who could talk investors into impossible deals, who could reshape narratives in a single conversation, fail to find a sentence. She slid the second envelope toward him. "And this," she said, "is my response." He did not touch it. "Open it," she said. His hands shook as he did. The sound of the paper tearing was almost unbearably loud in the stillness of the room. Inside were the divorce papers, prepared, precise, final. Whitney let out a small, broken sound. Grant stared down at the documents as though the words might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. "Simone," he said again, and now there was no performance left in it. "Please." It was the first time she had ever heard him ask for anything without confidence. The first time the word had not been wrapped in charm. She leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, in clarity. "Tonight," she said, "you will listen." He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not the woman who had stood beside him in photographs, not the partner who had smoothed his path, the woman who had watched him for 18 months and said nothing while she gathered the truth with surgical precision. "We had a good marriage," he said weakly. "We had problems, yes, but—" "A mistake," she interrupted gently, "is forgetting an anniversary, saying something cruel in an argument, being late to a dinner." Her gaze did not leave his. "You don't accidentally build a second life." Whitney closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her face in silence. Grant turned to her, his voice rising in panic. "I love you," he said. And then, as though the words might save him, he turned back to Simone. "I love you." The room seemed to contract around the sentence. Simone's expression did not change. "Don't," she said quietly. "Use that word as a bandage for a wound you created." She let the silence settle again. "Let it do the work." "Here is what will happen," she continued. "You will sign those papers. You will leave this house tonight, and you will not turn this into a story in which I am the cold wife who drove you away." His head snapped up. "You would destroy me," he said. "No," Simone replied. "You did that yourself. I am simply deciding whether the consequences remain private." Grant looked down at the documents, at the life he had built, at the woman he had believed would always remain beside him, adjusting, accommodating, preserving the illusion. His shoulders sagged. The performance was over. In the quiet that followed, Simone became aware of her own breathing, slow, even, the way it was after a successful surgery, when the body on the table had stabilized and the crisis had passed. She looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something that felt almost like distance, a man she had once loved, a stranger, a lesson. "Sit down, Grant," she had said, and he had. For the first time in their entire marriage, he had nowhere else to go. The silence after the envelopes were opened did not feel like an ending. It felt like documentation. Grant sat motionless, the divorce papers still in his hands, the crisp edges bending slightly where his grip had tightened. Whitney's tears had slowed into a stunned stillness, her body folded inward as though she were trying to make herself smaller inside a room that had suddenly become too bright, too real. Simone did not rush the moment. In surgery, there was a point after the incision when nothing could be hurried, when the body had to be allowed to adjust to what had been revealed. This was that point. She reached for the first envelope and opened it herself. Inside, the pages were arranged with the care of an archivist. No emotion, no commentary, just structure. She slid the first sheet across the table and turned it so Grant could see. A timeline, clean, linear, 18 months of Wednesdays. Beside each date, 2 columns. His stated location, his actual one. He stared at it without blinking. This isn't, he began. Record, Simone said. Not a correction, a definition. She moved to the next page. Hotel invoices, ride histories, timestamps that aligned with the messages he had sent her from the car. Running late, thinking about you, miss you already. Whitney made a sound then, not a sob, not a word, but something low and involuntary. The sound of someone watching the architecture of their own reality collapse. Simone did not look at her. Not yet. This is not about humiliation, she said. Her voice remained even, almost clinical. It is not about pain. It is not about winning. Grant's eyes lifted to hers. Then what is it about? He asked, his voice hollow. Accuracy. The word settled in the center of the table. More powerful than any accusation. For 10 years, she continued, I have lived inside a narrative that you helped write. A story in which we were equal, transparent, aligned. She turned another page. A series of printed messages. 2 columns again. On the left, the texts he had sent to her. On the right, the ones he had sent to Whitney on the same days. Different language, same structure. The same promises of future time. The same reassurances. The same careful management of absence. Whitney's hand rose to her mouth. Grant looked from one column to the other, as though trying to locate himself between them. You see, Simone said softly, this is not betrayal in the abstract. This is pattern. She paused, allowing the word to settle. In my work, pattern is the difference between coincidence and condition. The room had grown colder. Or perhaps it was only that the truth had removed the warmth of illusion. Grant pushed his chair back slightly, as if he needed space to breathe. You've been building this, he said. For how long? 6 weeks, she replied. The answer seemed to strike him harder than the documents. You knew, he said. You knew, and you observed, she corrected. Because confrontation without structure becomes denial, and denial erases reality. I was not interested in erasing anything. Whitney looked at Simone then, really looked at her. Not as the wife, not as the other woman's opposite, but as a force she had not understood until that moment. This is why you invited me, Whitney whispered. Simone met her gaze. Yes, not to hurt me. No. Whitney's eyes filled again, but the tears did not fall. To show me, she said. To show both of you, Simone replied, that the story you were living was not a matter of interpretation. She lifted the final document, a photograph, grainy, taken from across the street. Grant and Whitney seated at a small table by a window, their heads inclined toward each other in a posture that could only be read one way. The date in the corner. The same Wednesday, Simone had performed a 9-hour procedure. Grant closed his eyes. Whitney looked at the image as if it were a stranger. I told you I was in Colombia, he said, his voice breaking. Simone did not answer. She did not need to. The record spoke. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of the assembled truth filled the room, pressing against the walls, against the glass, against the 3 bodies sitting at the table. This is not revenge, Simone said again, more quietly now. Revenge is emotional. It is loud. It seeks a reaction. She placed her hand flat on the stack of papers. This is a record, and a record does not need to raise its voice. Grant let out a breath that seemed to empty him. What do you want from me? He asked. Simone considered the question. Not for its content, for its implication. For you to understand, she said, that this moment is not about punishment. She looked at Whitney. And it is not about her. Then back at Grant, it is about the end of a false history. The distinction mattered, because for years she had participated in maintaining that history, smoothing its inconsistencies, absorbing its fractures, translating his absence into acceptable language. Tonight she was not dismantling him. She was restoring the factual version of her own life. Whitney straightened in her chair, her voice fragile but steady. I didn't know, she said again. Simone nodded. I believe you. Grant looked between them, bewildered. You're not angry? He asked. Simone almost smiled. I have been in operating rooms where a heart stopped and then started again under my hands, she said. After that, anger becomes a very small emotion. She gathered the pages back into their precise order, aligned the edges, closed the folder. The sound was soft. Final. This is the last time we will discuss this in this room, she said. Grant's head lifted. Whitney's breath caught. From this point forward, it exists only in legal language and in memory. She slid the divorce papers toward him again. Sign. He looked at the pen as though it were an instrument he did not recognize. This is the end, he said. No, Simone replied. This is the correction. The distinction hung between them. For him, it was loss. For Whitney, it was the collapse of a narrative she had believed in. For Simone, it was alignment. Grant picked up the pen. His hands shook as he placed it on the paper. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car passed. The sound moved through the night as it always had, indifferent to the transformation taking place inside the house. Whitney watched him sign as if witnessing a ceremony she had never intended to attend. Simone watched the ink form his name with the same calm attention she gave to sutures closing an incision. When he finished, the room did not change. The table was still set for 3. The lilies were still open, too wide. The candles still unlit. But the air had shifted. Not with violence, with precision. Simone took the signed papers and placed them back in the envelope. Not triumph, not relief, completion. This is not revenge, she said one last time. Her voice so soft it was almost a private thought. This is record. And the record, once made, could never be rewritten. The word signed did not end the evening. It altered its temperature. Grant sat very still, the pen lying on the table in front of him, as though it had burned him and he had dropped it. The final curve of his name had barely dried on the paper, yet already it seemed to belong to a version of his life that no longer existed. Whitney had withdrawn into silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes no longer searching for explanation, but for something steadier. Ground, perhaps, in a room where every foundation had shifted. Simone did not gather the plates. She did not move to clear the table or soften the scene. Ritual mattered. Closure required language. She opened the second envelope, the one Grant had not yet examined. Not the divorce decree, the settlement. She slid it toward him. This is the part that happens next, she said. Her voice carried the same tone she used in boardrooms when presenting surgical funding proposals. Composed, exact, without ornament. Grant looked at the document, but did not touch it. I don't want your money, he said reflexively, as if dignity might still be negotiated. This is not about money, Simone replied. It never had been. He forced himself to look down. Pages of clean legal language. Division of assets, transfer of property, the Charleston house to Simone, the development shares to him, equal, measured, generous, too generous. His eyes moved faster as he read, searching for the trap. Why would you, he began. Because this is not a war, she said. She rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers interlaced. It is an exit. The word settled between them. Not punishment, not exile, exit, a door. A direction. Whitney's head lifted slightly at the sound of it, as though she understood that she was witnessing something that had nothing to do with her, and yet had changed her life irrevocably. There are 2 conditions, Simone continued. Grant's gaze flickered to hers. This agreement remains private. He blinked. And if it doesn't? Simone held his eyes without any visible change in expression. If you attempt to reshape the narrative, she said, if you suggest in any public or private space that this separation was the result of my absence, my ambition, my failure as a wife, she paused. Not for effect, for accuracy, the record becomes public. The words did not carry threat, they carried fact. Grant's face went pale. You wouldn't, he said, but there was no conviction in it. She had already done the most difficult thing. He knew that now. You built your career on image, she said quietly. Investors, donors, city councils, they believe in a story. The story of the progressive developer with a perfect marriage and a moral compass. She did not need to say more. He saw it. The headlines, the boardrooms, The slow withdrawal of confidence. The way reputation did not collapse in a single moment, but dissolved, layer by layer, until nothing remained but documentation. This protects both of us, she added. The truth of it was almost unbearable, because it was. She was offering him a version of dignity he had not offered her. Whitney turned to look at him then, really look at him, as if for the first time, not the man who had promised her a future, the man whose present had just been defined by a contract. "And if I sign this?" he asked. "You walk away," Simone said, her voice softened by the smallest degree. "You take what is yours. You keep your name. You keep your company. You keep the illusion that your life continues without fracture." "And you?" he asked. The question carried something raw in it. Not love, not regret, but the realization that for 10 years he had never truly asked what she wanted for herself. "I keep my life," she said. "Not the house, not the assets, her life." Whitney inhaled sharply, because she understood in that moment that the negotiation had never been about her. She had been a variable in a much larger equation. Grant turned the pages slowly. The precision of the terms left him no space for performance, no argument, no appeal. He had always been the one who negotiated, who shaped outcomes. Now the structure had been written by someone else. "You planned all this," he said, his voice low. "Yes." "For how long?" Simone considered. "Long enough to understand what I would not carry with me into the next version of my life." He let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any breath. "You're giving me a choice that isn't a choice," he said. "Every exit is like that," she replied. "You either walk through it quietly or you force it open and let everyone watch." Whitney's eyes closed briefly. The room had become a place where language itself had weight. Grant picked up the pen again. This time, his hand did not shake as much. He signed the settlement with the mechanical focus of someone who understood that resistance had become irrelevant. When he finished, he did not look at Simone. He looked at the table, at the three place settings, at the life that had existed there an hour ago and no longer did. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you leave," she said. The simplicity of it stripped the moment of drama. No raised voices, no shattered glass, just direction. Whitney stood slowly, as if her body had remembered gravity. "I should go," she said, her voice barely audible. Simone looked at her. Not with forgiveness, not with accusation, with recognition. "Yes," she said gently, "you should." Whitney hesitated, then spoke, not to Grant, but to Simone. "I didn't know," she said one last time. "I know," Simone replied. The exchange was quiet, complete. Whitney walked toward the door, her steps unsteady but purposeful. And when it closed behind her, the house seemed to expand. Grant remained in his chair. For a moment, he looked like a man who had lost his map. "Simone," he said. She rose. The movement was fluid, unhurried. There was nothing left to discuss. He stood as well, the reflex of a decade of shared spaces. For the first time, he did not reach for her. "Was there ever a moment," he asked, "when you thought about staying?" She met his gaze, honest, clear. "No." The word did not carry cruelty, only truth. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a verdict he had known was coming. When he walked out of the dining room, his footsteps sounded unfamiliar. The rhythm of a man who no longer belonged to the architecture of the house. The front door closed with a soft, almost polite sound. Simone remained where she was for a long time, the table still set for three, the candles still unlit, the lilies beginning to wilt at the edges. Private or public, the choice had been his. The life that remained was entirely hers. Grant did not understand the scale of the loss the night he left the house. In his mind, departure still carried the structure of strategy, a temporary retreat, a recalibration, the beginning of a version of events he could eventually reshape into something survivable. He moved into a furnished apartment overlooking the Cooper River, its glass walls offering a view that was meant to suggest continuity. The same water, the same skyline, the same city that had once spoken his name with admiration. But glass, he discovered, did not hold memory the way old walls did. It reflected, and in reflection there was no place to stand. The first consequence arrived in silence. Not from Simone, from the absence of her, For 10 years, she had been the quiet architecture beneath his life. The one who remembered which donor preferred handwritten notes, which council member's daughter was applying to medical school, which charity event required his presence rather than his name. He had believed these things arranged themselves. Now invitations began to arrive addressed only to him, and he found himself uncertain whether to attend, whether his presence would carry the same weight without the woman whose composure had translated his ambition into trust. At the first event he went to alone, the shift was almost imperceptible. The same room, the same people, the same music, but the greetings were shorter, the conversations thinner. "Where's Simone?" someone asked, the question light, social, automatic. "She's focusing on the hospital," he replied, the sentence prepared, practiced. A pause followed. Not suspicion, not yet. Just the faint, instinctive recognition that a structure had changed. He felt it in the way the conversation moved away from him a moment sooner than it once had. In the way the board chairman nodded politely instead of drawing him into a private discussion. In the way the room no longer opened around him, but allowed him to stand within it without expansion. Simone had not been his accessory. She had been his legitimacy. At the office, the consequences were more concrete. Simone had never attended the strategy meetings for his developments, never asked for a role in his business, but her name, her reputation, had existed in every introduction. His wife, Dr. Simone Carter, chief of cardiothoracic surgery. Investors trusted men who were chosen by women like her. Stability, integrity, a life that appeared structured. Without that context, he was only a developer with aggressive timelines and ambitious projections. Questions that had once been softened by personal admiration began to land with sharper edges. We'd like to review the long-term sustainability plan again. Let's hold on the next phase until we see stronger community support. Community support. He had always assumed it belonged to him. Now he began to understand that it had belonged to them. Whitney did not call. Not the next day, not the day after. When she finally sent a message, it was brief. "I need time. Please don't contact me." He read it, standing in the middle of his new living room, the river stretching beyond the glass, like a distance he could not cross. For months, he had existed in two parallel lives, moving between them with the confidence of a man who believed in his own narrative. Now both had collapsed, and he stood in a space that contained neither. He tried to reconstruct himself in the only language he knew. Work, long hours, new proposals, meetings scheduled back to back so that the silence of the apartment would not have time to settle into him. But work, he discovered, had always been amplified by the life he returned to. The late nights had meant something because Simone had been there when he came home. A light in the kitchen, a question about his day, the quiet understanding of someone who knew the cost of ambition because she paid it too. Now success, when it came, had no witness. And without a witness, it felt smaller. The city did not turn against him. Simone had kept her word. There were no headlines, no whispered scandals, only a gradual recalibration. He was still invited, still consulted, still addressed with respect. But the warmth had altered. The instinctive trust that had once surrounded him like an atmosphere was gone. In its place was professionalism, measured, neutral. He saw it most clearly the night he attended a hospital fundraiser alone. Simone was there, across the room, in black, speaking to a circle of donors who leaned toward her with the kind of attention that had once belonged to him. She did not avoid his gaze. When their eyes met, she inclined her head in a gesture that was neither cold nor intimate. Recognition, nothing more. The space around her was luminous, not because she had changed, because she was no longer reflecting him. He understood then, with a clarity that came too late to be useful, that he had not lost a wife. He had lost the axis of his life, the person who had translated his ambition into meaning, the presence that had turned his house into a home, and his name into something larger than himself. Whitney eventually returned to Charleston, not to him. He saw her once, across a cafe, her hair shorter, her expression different, not broken, not bitter, but self-contained in a way that suggested she had stepped out of a narrative and refused to enter another one. She looked at him, held his gaze for a moment, then turned away. No accusation, no longing, just absence. That was the final consequence. Not public ruin, not dramatic loss. Absence. The gradual understanding that every room he entered now belonged entirely to him, and that without the woman who had once shared those spaces, they were smaller, quieter, finite. He had believed the marriage was a part of his life, a beautiful part, an important part, replaceable. Now he moved through days that contained everything he had worked for. The projects, the contracts, the skyline slowly changing under his direction, and felt the hollow center where the witness had been. Simone had not taken anything from him. She had simply stepped out of the frame. And in doing so, she revealed how much of what he had believed was his had always been built on her presence. Spring arrived in Charleston the way healing does, not as a single moment, but as a series of small permissions. Windows opened, light lingered longer on the floors. The air carried the scent of water and something beginning again. Simone did not mark the date of the divorce becoming official. There was no ceremony, no symbolic gesture. Her life did not begin at the end of something. It continued, only now it belonged entirely to her. The house changed first, not in its structure, in its atmosphere. The dining room table was moved closer to the windows, where the morning light fell in clean, uninterrupted lines. The heavy oil painting Grant had chosen was replaced by a large, abstract canvas in deep blues and gold, a piece she had once loved but never bought because it had not fit the room. Now the room fit her. The guest bedroom became a study, not a decorative space but a working one. Walls lined with medical journals, research proposals, architectural sketches for something that had lived quietly in her mind for years. The Carter Institute for Cardiac Equity, a surgical training and patient access center for communities that had always been asked to wait. The idea had existed long before the marriage ended. It had been postponed for practical reasons, for timing, for his projects, for the shared calendar that had required compromise. Now there was no compromise. She built it the way she had rebuilt her life, with precision, with patience, with a clarity that did not need permission. The hospital board meeting where she presented the proposal was the first time the city saw her outside the frame of Grant Holloway's wife. Not because she spoke differently, because she occupied the space alone. Her voice carried across the room with the calm authority of a woman who had spent her life holding hearts in her hands and returning them to the world. Data, funding models, community partnerships, a vision so detailed it felt inevitable. When the vote passed unanimously, the applause was not loud. It was sustained. Respect, she had learned, did not need volume. Afterward, in the corridor, donors approached her with the same language they had once used for both of them. But now every word landed where it belonged. Your institute will change this city. We believe in your leadership. You built something extraordinary. Not you two, not your family, her. The new office overlooked the harbor, not the tallest building, not the most prestigious address, but the windows opened wide, and in the afternoons the light moved across the floor like a living thing. On the wall behind her desk hung a single photograph, not of her, not of an award ceremony, a surgical team, residents and fellows, standing around a patient who had survived against every statistical expectation. Their masks were down, their faces exhausted. Radiant, witness, that was the word she understood now in its truest form. Not the person who watched you perform, the person who stood beside you while you built something that mattered. She saw Grant only once more, at a city planning forum. Their eyes met across the room, the recognition clean, unburdened. He looked well, older, less certain in the way he held his shoulders. He inclined his head. She returned the gesture. Two people who had once shared a life, now sharing only a past. There was no triumph in her chest, no echo of what had been lost, only distance. He had projects she would never enter. She had a world he could never touch. Because the Institute was not a house, not a marriage, not an image that required agreement to exist. It was built from her work, her name, her vision. From years of becoming someone whose authority came from within. Some evenings she remained in the office after everyone else had left, the city dissolving into twilight beyond the glass. She would walk through the surgical wing, the classrooms, the research labs still smelling faintly of fresh paint and possibility. Her heels made a quiet, steady sound against the floor. Not an echo, a rhythm. The new throne was not a chair. It was a life, one she did not have to defend. One no one could be unfaithful to. One that could not be negotiated away. In the house on the oak-lined street, the dining room held a different table now. Round, open, surrounded by mismatched chairs collected from places she had traveled alone. On Friday nights, her colleagues came for dinner. Residents who argued about technique, nurses who brought stories from the war, young girls from the scholarship program who sat beside her and spoke about the futures they were beginning to imagine. Laughter moved through the rooms without choreography. No performance, no brand, just presence. Sometimes when the evening ended and the house returned to quiet, she would stand at the window with a glass of wine and look out at the city that had once known her only as half of a perfect portrait. She did not feel the need to correct that history. It had served its purpose. It had led her here, to a life that carried her name alone. If you have ever believed that losing something meant losing yourself, remember this. There are structures that collapse so the foundation beneath them can finally be seen. There are endings that are not destruction but alignment. And there are women who do not take back their power because it was never gone. It was simply waiting for them to stop placing it in someone else's hands. If this story found you at a moment when your own life is asking to be rebuilt, quietly, precisely, on your own terms, stay. Walk with this journey. Share the part of it that mirrors your own. Because every time a woman chooses herself without apology, a new throne is built in a world that once told her to sit anywhere but her own center. In the morning, Simone would return to the institute, to the operating room, to the long, steady work of changing outcomes that had once been accepted as inevitable. Her name on the glass doors, her reflection moving toward them, not as someone's wife, not as someone's absence, as origin, as authority, as a woman whose life had become something no one could ever walk away from again.